Hello, everybody. Good afternoon, and thanks ever so much for joining us today for what is the third in our series of Connect with Climate Change events, a programme of talks put on in partnership between Scottish Power, Strathclyde University and Glasgow University, and really pleased that you've been able to join us today. The previous events, if you weren't able to join, are all available on the Connect for Climate Change website. And do go there, and this is where this event will be hosted in the future as well. So welcome to this event, Raising Ambition, a Tale of Two Regions. We've got a fantastic agenda for you with great speakers, great panelists, but importantly, I'm sure a great audience who will engage and share their questions and their thoughts. So please do, throughout this, use Slido and rank the questions as you see them come in, and we'll make sure we really do our best to kind of get to all of those. And just want to start by bringing up a poll, actually, to try and prompt some engagement and get you thinking about the topic for today's discussion, which is all around the challenge of place-based climate action. How does the high ambition of our local governments across Scotland and across the rest of the UK get translated into action? What are the enabling factors that we need to see in order to kind of support that accelerated response? What support is needed, and what are the big barriers that they face in realising ambitions of net zero quite often by 2030 or 2035? So if it's possible, I'll bring up the Slido poll. It should appear on your screen shortly. So if you could go to slido.com and the hashtag is CWCC, which of these areas do you think is most important in supporting an accelerated response to climate emergency in our communities? And just rank these in order of 1 to 6. And that will give us some interesting raw material for when we come to our Q&A at the end, or at least after the panel discussion. So that poll will stay open, and you can move between the poll and the Q&A function in Slido to ask your questions. I post these different categories because it's incredibly difficult to distinguish between the importance of these, because for different challenges, they all have particular relevance. But they're all, be interesting to see where the audience feels the kind of emphasis lies. I should actually, it's remiss of me, I should introduce myself. My name's Dr. Sam Gardner. I'm the Head of Climate Change and Sustainability with Scottish Power, and I'm also the Chair of the Edinburgh Climate Commission, and very engaged with and interested in how we support local communities, local government and stakeholders to deliver a place-based response to climate change that's fit for the people and communities that live in a particular area and deliver a just transition. So really interested in what we're going to hear from our speakers and the kind of response from all of you. That's all. I'm just going to run through our speakers, and then when I come to them individually, I'll introduce them. But in the first instance, we're going to hear from Gavin Slater, who is Head of Sustainability at Glasgow Council. We'll then hear from Neil Commode, who's Managing Director at EMEC on Orkney. Really interesting contrast between two different geographies, two different places, both going about trying to tackle climate change in ways that are fit for their communities and their environments. And then we'll have responses from our three panelists: Dr. Jen Roberts, Chancellor's Fellow in Energy from the University of Glasgow; Professor Ken Gibb, Professor of Housing Economics at the University of Glasgow; and Ellie Harrison, Chair of Glasgow's Community Energy. So that's the running order, and without further ado, I'm going to pass over to Gavin, who will be our first speaker. Gavin will speak for about 10 minutes, and then I will introduce Neil after that. So thanks ever so much, everybody. Thanks for joining, and over to you, Gavin.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. As Sam says, I'm going to take you through a very quick run of what we've done in Glasgow in terms of our achievements up to 2020 and our plans to be net zero carbon by 2030. So if we just have the slides on the screen there, looking at where we started as a city, in 2006, we began to look at climate change very seriously and explore what we needed to do. In 2010, we set up the Sustainable Glasgow Partnership. And with that came the Sustainable Glasgow Report, which was at the time a very high level aspirational document, and it set a target of reducing CO2 emissions by 30%. Within that, there was 33 actions set out, and at the time it was predicted to cost us in the region of 1.4 billion, I think, to achieve those. As we progressed, we got involved in different projects, one being the EU FP7 Step Up project, which took the Sustainable Glasgow Report and basically updated it from being an aspirational document to a much more technical document. Done in partnership with Scottish Power and the University of Strathclyde. That really pioneered heat mapping long before the Scottish Government took that on as a way to understand energy consumption in cities, but it retained those actions and it retained the same target. So how did we do? As of 2018, which was our last data set, because it's reported 2 years in arrears, we had actually achieved a 37.5% reduction in CO2, so well ahead of target. We reached 30% in 2015. Looking at that on a sectoral basis, a lot of that reduction is in electricity. That's due to local efforts and national efforts in terms of the decarbonisation of electricity. But what this shows is there's still a real issue with heat and transport in the city and something that we need to address. How did we do that? We did that in several different ways. We have wind turbines, okay, so Glasgow only has one. It's a bit of a challenge having wind turbines in an urban environment, but we're still proud of our one big turbine sitting up there on the Cascan Braes. We have covered our schools in solar panels. We have seen solar panels over a huge number of houses owned by housing associations in the city as well. We actually won awards back in 2014 for having the most coverage of any city in Scotland. We've worked with community projects like Ellie's Glasgow Community Energy and putting solar panels on schools and looking at how that benefits the community with the money that's generated from that, so that the community group or Glasgow Community Energy basically sell us the power and use that money to enhance the local community. We have built a £154 million Glasgow Recycling and Renewable Energy Centre, which, if you have the artists to believe, is one of the most romantic places in Glasgow to go for a walk, but it's also a massive, massive contributor to renewable energy in the city, taking 90% of our waste away from landfill and turning it into electricity. There's also a huge potential for heat recovery from that plant as well, one which we have yet to exploit properly. We built the Commonwealth Games Athletes Village, covered in solar, as you can see, but also one of the first major district heating networks that is in the city, gas CHP at the time. We're now moving very much away from thinking about gas CHP, but still, you know, a real landmark development, working with 3 housing associations and providing heat and power to local schools, as well as the Emirates Arena and the indoor velodrome. We've worked with our universities. That chimney that you see there is from Glasgow University's district heating system, made to look like a ship reminiscent of those in the Clyde. And we've also looked at even more advanced district heating schemes like this air source heat pump scheme in the south of the city. We've also taken on some transport measures. We've seen cycling in the city since the Commonwealth Games rise dramatically, not only thanks to the MAC bikes, but also thanks to the infrastructure that we've put in place. Electric vehicles are on the rise as well, so a number of electric vehicle chargers in the city, somewhere near 300, both on and off street. We had a policy initially of the parking and charging being free, and we're starting to see the numbers of owners of electric vehicles or car club electric vehicles being used in the city grow as well. And then lastly, but not least, through the pandemic, we've accelerated our powers and worked on spaces for people, which has seen significant parts of the city handed over for walking, wheeling and cycling, which is creating a much nicer place to be in the city, but also helping deal with some of those transport issues. We've also worked on projects like the Future City Glasgow, which took a very techno approach to dealing with the climate. We did various different things in relation to energy. We deployed sensors when we were doing insulation retrofits, so that we could actually test the change in environmental conditions within houses, not just in terms of heat retention, but in terms of moisture buildup and other factors that maybe weren't considered at first when thinking about insulation. We mapped every bit of vacant and derelict land in the city for, at the time, just solar deployment, looking at all the planning, policy and technical constraints. But since then have taken that on to look at various other different renewables as well. We've worked on demand side management, putting different bits of kit in our buildings, allowing us to be dynamically responsive to power needs and power demands and also power availability. And we've also developed a web portal as well, which was designed to help people understand their own consumption and maybe give them a bit more information on how they could, at a domestic level, improve the performance of their own properties. In addition to that, we've also been running the EU Ruggedised project, again, with partners, Scottish Power and others, University of Strathclyde again, across the city, looking to work with other cities in Europe, in this case Rotterdam, Umeå, Brno, Parma and Gdansk, to develop smart districts in cities. So in Glasgow, that involves the development of district heating, looking at not just the infrastructure side, but actually what's more difficult, I think, in cities is the actually contractual side. So how do you actually contractually start selling and buying heat from non-energy providers, something that we as a city or as a nation are not completely comfortable with. It's also looked at installing solar canopies on the roofs of car parks connected to battery storage and electric vehicle charging. Those battery stores are also connected to domestic properties to look at storing renewable energy when it's available and making that available to both car charging, parasitic load on buildings, but also domestic customers as well, who maybe don't have access to roof space to have their own solar in. So to get to net zero by 2030, after all that good work, we declared a state of climate and ecological emergency. We brought in a cross-political party and lots of external advisors, pressure groups, lobbyists, experts to give us recommendations, and they gave us 60 of those. At the core of that was sustainability and social justice, which remains absolutely the core of everything that we do. And those recommendations were then transferred from the work of the working group into our climate plan. And at the core of that is delivery of net zero carbon by 2030. We also relaunched the Sustainable Glasgow Partnership in 2020 and set out 4 new thematic hubs to try and concentrate the work of the partnership on heating and housing, green infrastructure and transport, green in the city and rewilding, and the green economy in the private sector. And currently those hubs are meeting every single month, as well as the board. So we're putting hours and hours of work into that and beginning to reap the rewards of that effort. We have a number of plans and policies that underpin all of the work that we're doing in terms of our climate plan and net zero. I won't read them all out to you, but there is the circular economy route map, our biodiversity action plan, our transport strategy, our open space strategy, so many there, which the climate plan refers to, where a bulk of the work's been done. We also have our local heat and energy efficiency strategy, which is a much more technical document, which brings together energy planning and housing strategy. And that all sits within a context of national and local government agenda as well, and policies and all the rest of it, which sets the framework for how we're trying to achieve these net zero ambitions. Very quickly, just going on to our climate plan. Our climate plan was launched just a couple of weeks ago. It went through a committee. That within there has broken down a number of actions across themes, and you can see in the centre there the 5 themes. The grey circle around those themes should be complete, not segmented. That's been amended in the plan. But this takes the UN Sustainable Development Goals and attaches them to each of the thematic work streams that we have in the plan. And we're using those SDGs as a sort of common language across all of our plans and policies to try and help people connect the dots, as it were. I'm trying to go on to the next slide, but it's not moving. Don't know if there's a little help there, but there we go. The plan has set out actions and milestones. Again, we don't have time today to go through all of those, but I encourage you to go and look at it and look at what we plan to do year on year as we travel towards that 2030 target. And ultimately, the main things that we plan to do to reach that net zero target are the delivery of our technical feasibility study for net zero, delivery of the climate plan and the actions within. Most importantly, I think, or one of the most important things, is the delivery of a Green New Deal for Glasgow. We understand that this is likely to cost somewhere in the region of between 4 billion and 29 billion to make that transition at a city level. So we need massive investment, and we're about to launch a prospectus, an investment prospectus for the city, to look at different ways that we can bring that finance into the city. We're working on a massive investment in retrofit as well as continuing to develop the networks that we have. Finally, just to make you aware, we've launched the new Sustainable Glasgow website. There's a lot of stuff in there about the circular economy, the various different projects we have, case studies, what we're working on, what we plan to work on. The papers that go to the Sustainable Glasgow board are available there, as well as our Sustainable Glasgow Charter, which we have just launched as a way to try and engage businesses across the city in this journey to net zero, both large and small, collating all of the plans, projects, strategies that businesses have to reach net zero, as well as working with those SMEs that perhaps want to be part of that journey, but don't yet have the resource to build those plans. So hopefully this gives some oversight as to the journey that we've been on, the journey that we continue to travel on, and our aspirations to reach net zero by 2030. Thanks very much.
Thanks ever so much, Gavin, for a rattle through a huge amount of work, both planned and in the immediate past. And I'm sure that's given a lot of kind of thought for questions. So please do go to Slido, pose your questions, try and understand a bit more about what's going on in Glasgow. If you come out of full screen, you can see Slido there, or just go to the Slido website on your phone or somewhere else and post your questions there. So please do that. Now, I'm really pleased to be able to hand over to Neil, who's the director at EMEC on Orkney. Beautiful islands, very fond memories of being there and actually having a visit to EMEC many years ago. But I'm sure will be a really interesting presentation and a contrast to what we've just heard from Gavin, which is the aim. So thanks ever so much, Neil, and over to you.
Thanks very much indeed, and thanks to Scottish Power for the opportunity to talk to you today. Yes, Neil Kerber, Managing Director at EMEC, based in Stromness in Orkney. I've got a few slides really to try and show what's happened on the journey that's gone on in Orkney as a whole. And if one thinks of what Orkney is, many people think of it, if you even know where it is, but most people do now, I'm pleased to say, think of it really in terms of the landscape and the architecture and the archaeology and the stunning views. And the people don't generally tend to think of it for the innovation that's going on. In terms of the top right-hand corner, that was the world's most powerful tidal turbine. It's now been replaced by another one. Bottom right is some low-energy housing with integral solar, and they've now got battery storage in them. You know, top left are the fleet of vessels which are installing marine energy devices on the site that I manage, and then bottom left is our electrolyzer, which was the first one that we'd put in that actually made hydrogen from tidal energy for the first time anywhere. So this is a place where innovation is actually happening. To make it absolutely contemporary and real for you right now, we've got various things that are on the go, and the top two slides show the tidal turbine, the O2 turbine from Orbital, launched in Dundee, first vessel manufactured in Dundee in 40 years at that shipyard, on its way towed up to the site on Edy, where it's being installed, and that'll generate around 2 megawatts of energy. In addition to that, we've also got Magallanes, a Spanish company, with their tidal turbine up there, and more recently on our Wave test site, we've been joined by Motion with their small scale 100 kilowatt wave energy machine. So there's a lot of actual innovation going on here, and the question is, how is this contributing towards climate change, or the mitigation of climate change? And really, it's part of an ecosystem that operates in Orkney. We are one entity, and we've been very grateful to be able to be formed in Orkney, because it's a community which seems to behave rather differently to innovation. The community really is based around three distinct parts. There's the business, the public sector, and then the third sector. And as in most communities, these work individually, but also interact and work together in certain ways. But over 20 years ago, there was a great vision and foresight shown about the whole issue about renewables and energy efficiency, which gave rise to the creation of a thing called OREF, which is the Orkney Renewable Energy Forum. And that's met. It now meets every month, and it's an opportunity to exchange ideas very much across those three sectors. And out of that, some schemes have come, which I'll talk about in a second. But also, we're not the only one, because there are other organisations which are working across the other sectors like arts, crafts, agriculture, tourism, etc. And those groups themselves also meet, and it gives us, as from an energy point of view, a good chance to interact with some of those other fora. Now, one of the things that came out of OREF was a gathering together at the time when the industrial strategy was launched, which effectively was looking for projects which would seek to pilot decarbonisation. And from the fact that we'd worked together for the best part of 20 years, a number of organisations came together and formed a thing called the Reflex Project. And that's part funded by UK Research and Innovation. And the Reflex Project is seeking to decarbonise transport, heat, and put storage into the electrical network. There isn't time to talk through the whole Reflex project, but I can give more details about that later if people are interested. But the project itself has looked at a number of ways in which we're trying to decarbonise the energy system. I'm going to talk to you about a couple of outputs distinctly from it. One of which was that one of the members, Solo SMS, looked at the UK electricity system as it stood at the time, and that shows really back in August 2019 the amount of generation that was going on from renewables and the electricity demand of the network. And if you look at the green line at the bottom, the spikes on it are principally solar, and the waveform in it is principally wind. And so that was what we were seeing back in 2019. And they thought, well, what happens if you simply quadruple the amount of renewables that are going to be on the network? And if you simply quadruple that number in that green line, you end up with that shape. And this is what we've actually got in Orkney today. So the point is that we have already got a network which is going to remind us of how a more intensively renewabled up network is going to work. And there are several things to note here. One is that the blue line is the electricity demand and the red is the supply. And there are periods when the blue is above the red, i.e. we don't have enough electricity to make it all work. But there's also periods of extensive surfeit of renewable electricity. And so handling these deficits and surfeits and the intermittency aspects is a key part of the energy system, and we've been working really hard at that, which has led us towards hydrogen, which I'm going to talk about towards right at the end. The other thing we also did from the Reflex project very early doors was refresh something that we had done some time ago by another of the partners, Aquaterra, and they had done an energy audit back in 2013-14, I think it was, and we refreshed that in 2019, and that energy audit shows a number of interesting things. The left-hand side, and this may actually have not transferred as well as I'd hoped because I might have over-compressed it when I sent the file, so forgive me, but I can make the information available if people are interested. But basically, left-hand side is showing where we're using the energy. The column in underneath the 2019 are the fuels that we're using. From the top, that's LPG. The broader one at the top is kerosene. The next broad purpley one is electricity. In between that is peat and coal. And then we go into road diesel and gas oil, and down the bottom end is gas oil for marine uses. And the point is that the audit showed which fuels we're using, and it also showed what we are using them for. And what it discloses is, yes, we're using a lot for heat and light, but actually transport is really big for us. And in fact, if you look at the darkish blue bit towards the bottom, which is principally shipping, that is about as big as we use in our domestic situations. So for us, shipping is a significant energy use and therefore a significant carbon dioxide producer. So we've recognised that's something we really need to tackle. The other thing we've also been looking at is, because of grid inadequacies, for historical reasons more than anything, although some regulatory bits don't help, we've ended up trying to use as much energy as we possibly can, because on occasions, as you saw from the previous graph, when the red is above the blue, we do actually create more electricity than we need. So can we need more? Can we displace things? Because at the moment, what we've succeeded in doing is effectively decarbonising that bit, the electricity bit, but all the rest of that column is still based on fossil fuels. So can we start to displace fuels in other ways? And we've really focused on a couple of things, one of which is our electric vehicles. And I want to talk to you about that, because as a community, we've been logging information about electric vehicles since they first appeared in Orkney in about 2012, 2013, something like that. And That's been done as a community-based activity where people have contributed their data every month, sharing the mileages of what they're actually doing in their electric vehicles. And this has built up knowledge about how EVs actually work. So this is a graph showing the numbers of EVs. We're now just over 300 EVs, but we also know the average distances that EVs travel, which interestingly is more than the Scottish average for vehicles that the distances that vehicles travel. We know how those mileages change on a month-by-month basis over years, and the answer is they don't. So that's helpful to understand. And we've also understood, as a result of introducing charges for charging, i.e. we've started to charge people for charging their electric vehicles in public, the green blocks on those diagrams are actually the number of charges that were undertaken, and the orange and the blue were when the charging was free. So we've seen very clearly that charging for charging has an effect, and it caused something like a 70% reduction in charging activity in the public domain, but we know those cars are still being used, so they're being charged at home. So we understand pieces about it. So these are critically important factors, and we think this socialized knowledge or citizen science knowledge is actually really helpful to help drive behavioral change. The last thing I really want to talk about very much is what we've been doing with hydrogen, and we've been producing hydrogen from tidal energy and also from wind to work with a community turbine, and we've therefore got experience in the production of hydrogen, understanding how to store and transport it. We also understand something of the value of hydrogen, and that graph basically shows that on the right hand side, if we used hydrogen and made electricity with it, it's worth about 30 pence a kilogram, but if we use it as a propulsion fuel, it's worth about £4.50 a kilogram. So that's helping us better understand what we should do with the assets that we do have. And in the bottom right hand corner is we've been working with a company called Zero Avia in a couple of projects with them about putting hydrogen into an aircraft which has been converted to run on fuel cells. We're also working with ferries, and we're also working with cars. So there's a huge amount actually going on. And the last point I really wanted to make is that to talk about the impact of all this work that we've done. And principally what we've been doing is we've really much been learning by doing. So the practical demonstration and testing of equipment to make sure that it works, and it works as well as the manufacturers both intend and promise. We also have effectively been creating what we call pre-commercial knowledge, because these are not businesses, these are still very much in an R&D space, but we're understanding how businesses can be created. And in addition to that, this practical demonstration really is leading us towards making actual progress. And at the moment, we're making progress towards net zero on land, sea and air. So we're trying everything we can in our individual way, and we're really interested to know what other people are doing and what people think of this. So thank you very much indeed for your time this afternoon.
Thank you ever so much, Neil, for that rattle through of all that is going on in Orkney. Fascinating as a test bed for all sorts of new technologies, but also how those technologies are being adopted by communities and what you're learning in the process. So I'm sure hopefully that's prompted fresh questions from the audience. Please do go to Slido and post them and vote for the ones that you think are particularly interesting and engaging. So now we're just going to turn to our panel, who in turn are going to offer some reflections on what they've heard from the two speakers, and then also a little contribution from their own expertise and perspective on this challenge of how do we deliver an accelerated response to climate change that's fit for the places that people and communities live and work in. So first of all, I'm going to reintroduce Jen Roberts, who I attributed to completely the wrong university. There's only two I need to talk about, but I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Jen Roberts, who's the Chancellor's Fellow in Energy at the University of Strathclyde. Jen, over to you for some reflections.
Great, thanks Sam, and also thanks to Gavin and Neil for your perspectives there, all very positive. And I think sometimes when I join panels like this, I want to talk about the kind of technical stuff, but today I'm not going to do that. I'd like to build on some of what you've shared and pick up on three aspects that I think are particularly important to recognise when discussing local climate action in cities and rural communities, and which both Gavin and Neil kind of touched on lightly, but I guess I'd like to bring out a little bit more. And so the first is that word communities. People and place. Communities need to be at the heart of net zero transitions for several reasons, not least because this transition affects them, how people live and work, including the jobs that people do and how they live their lives. And therefore we need to kind of make sure that these transitions do not widen social inequalities, but also because there's an incredible potential to leverage the changes that must be made to bring like a range of co-benefits to the fore, so that the future on offer, this sustainable future that we need and that we in this room that we want, that future offers a kind of better future than what we currently have. So whether we're talking about rural or urban communities here, we need to adopt community-orientated or community-led, place-based participatory approaches to develop transparent decisions, integrated solutions that enable this kind of full suite of co-benefits to be recognised, captured, enhanced, and also ideally for these disbenefits to be reduced or designed out. Now, I realise this can sometimes sound a little bit kind of motherhood and apple pie, but there's a great deal of evidence that these participatory approaches not only enable projects or systems transitions that meets a range of stakeholder needs, they also nurture a sense of community, place, agency, self-efficacy, and support trust and tolerance of the decisions and changes being implemented, or that the communities themselves are driving. And so they can build community resilience. And so I'd quite like to bring that out a bit more, especially since sometimes the communities trying to drive climate action can face so many barriers. I'm sure Ellie will share more on that. So there's challenges there for community-led initiatives. So that was one thing I wanted to pick up on. There are two other words I wanted to kind of bring out. One was place-based and the other was integrated. So there's no single route to net zero, no one size fits all. We know this both complicates things and really helps things, because many aspects of transitions to net zero carbon must be tailored to place, context and community. And these place-based approaches to sustainable development, they aim to integrate kind of wider social, economic, environmental goals through collaboration and this kind of shared outcome, which today we're talking about these outcomes of the actions towards net zero, whatever those actions are. And in Scotland, we're actually incredibly, in a really good position, because the value of place-based approaches to development is translated into national policy through things like the place principle made by Scottish Government and initiatives like the Place Standard, which provides that framework to structure conversations around place with community, the community ecosystem. I think Neil used that word, community ecosystem, and so enabling kind of multiple actors to collaborate, plan for, and kind of measure these sustainability impacts, which is really exciting and enabling. But currently there is some confusion about what this really means in practice. There's a lack of understanding of what place-based can mean. There's misuse of the term. There's lack of knowledge or experience or training around the methods and approaches for placemaking, and kind of particularly bottom-up approaches for development. And so I think we need to do a bit better there. There's a huge role for sharing and exchanging approaches and experience and best practice so that we can collectively improve on this. And I really can support Neil's kind of a bid for sharing learning by doing, whether that's technical or also these kind of community embedded approaches. So I'm aware I was meant to be quite quick, but I guess my final reflection and contribution would be the importance of this integrated approach. I know that Gavin, you really brought this in your presentation too. And I think there's a real opportunity for much more integration, and to use a very politicised phrase, joined up thinking. I don't want to quote Boris too much, but yeah, the communities are very adept at identifying routes to join things up. And there are multiple ways in which we can kind of frame integration. And I'm not going to kind of list them off now, but I think the way that we are set up currently, institutionally and societally and so on, this makes it quite challenging. I'd be really interested to hear from Gavin and Neil about how you're supporting integration across sectors and silos and your experiences there to support integrated and sustainable net zero transition pathways. So that's my tuppence, or my threepence really. We need community, place-based and integrated solutions for local climate action, and a lot of knowledge and experience sharing to support doing this in practice. And I'll stop there and hand over.
Thank you ever so much, Jen. Really clear kind of insight and a little bit of challenge or question there as well, which we'll turn to, particularly the integration piece, which something I'm very conscious of in Edinburgh. There's so much happening, so much going on, so much bottom-up activity and so much well-intentioned top-down activity, and finding that, which is partly why in that poll I put the point about coordination and how do you bring that together and really make sure that all the activity is greater than the sum of its parts. So we will no doubt return to that. But now I'm very pleased to introduce Professor Ken Gibb, who is Professor of Housing Economics at the University of Glasgow. So over to you, Ken, for your reflections on what you've heard this afternoon.
Thanks, Sam, and very nice to be here too. So I direct something called the UK Collaborative Centre for Housing Evidence, and it's a consortium across the UK, and we are involved in a kind of small portfolio of climate change and housing related research projects. And I wanted to just talk briefly about one of those because I think it speaks to a number of the issues I wanted to raise. This project is a retrofit tenement demonstration project. We're evaluating it. It's a property in the south side of Glasgow owned by a housing association, has 8 one-bedroom flats in it. And we're trying to understand and learn lessons really for the broader retrofit of the more than 75,000 traditional tenements in Glasgow, which are by definition more than 100 years old. So the study involves trying to just understand the process of doing the construction work, a building performance kind of assessment, which involves more sensors into walls and things of that kind to understand heat and moisture and environmental effects. We're doing a cost benefit analysis, and we're doing a kind of assessment of the key decision-making processes that went on during it. So I'm very interested really, I guess, in what's being said about how we think that the environmental policies that we want to pursue in Glasgow, for instance, can be consistent with the needs of this specific problem of this huge iconic part of the housing system in the city. How can we find ways to join up all the bits and pieces and integrate solutions which allow us to retain the tenemental stock? Because if we don't find them, we're going to lose quite a lot of it, I suspect. So it's in that kind of context that I wanted to just reflect on a couple of things. One of the things that's really striking about the tenemental problem, and I think is also true of many of the issues we're talking about today, is this notion that we're actually dealing with a multi-layered complex system where there's adaptive learning that takes place over time. And one of the things that struck us quite early on is that there are necessary conditions to make tenemental retrofit work on a large scale, and that's actually about tenement law reform with multiple ownership of tenements, etc. A whole set of problems with common repairs. There needs to be fundamental legal reform to actually engage with the tens of thousands of individual actors who are homeowners or private landlords to actually deal with the thing in a comprehensive basis. And I think that sense of complexity is something that recurs all of the time. Second theme I wanted to raise just briefly is that this retrofit programme in the Glasgow City region, the broader city region, is a huge opportunity that the city region's grasping to try to help regrow the economy post COVID, and it's a major strand. And actually, Gavin and I were in a meeting about scoping assessment this morning about how this work might be undertaken by the city region. It's a really transformative thing that is being envisaged. So really understanding in the city region's context the 420,000 units that need to be retrofitted to get to EPC level C it quite boggles the mind actually, just thinking about the scale and size of what's undertaken and the very complexity of what's involved. So I think that's a good place to stop, just by actually raising those two very substantial points. So thanks very much.
Thank you ever so much, Ken. More real food for thought, and as if I haven't already made the point, please do engage and participate. Pose your questions on those. I mean, the retrofit challenge is a long-standing one, but one that we're going to have to grapple with. And picking up on other points being made earlier, how do we do that? I'm not just posing this question for us to reflect on now, but how do we do that and move at the pace and do learning whilst we're doing, often having to kind of move forward with imperfect knowledge about the interventions, whilst operating in the real world with people's homes and households and communities. And that's where the mandate for interventions and mandate for support is going to be so important. So final panelist, but by no means least, I'm very pleased to introduce Ellie Harrison, who's going to speak and introduce her perspective, and she is chair of Glasgow Community Energy. So thanks ever so much, Ellie, for joining us today, and I'll hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Sam. Thanks for inviting me to speak today, and thanks to Gavin for the shout out for Glasgow Community Energy. So I'm actually an artist and an activist. I've been living in Glasgow since 2008, and I volunteer with several local projects and campaigns that are aimed at making Glasgow a more equal, more sustainable and more connected city. So that includes the Get Glasgow Moving public transport campaign. So we want to see a world-class, fully integrated and affordable public transport network for our region, and also with Glasgow Community Energy. So Glasgow Community Energy is Glasgow's new community-owned renewable energy cooperative, a project that I've helped to set up over the last few years. And last summer, we signed an agreement with Glasgow City Council, which allowed us to install solar panels on the roofs of 2 schools, one in Easterhouse and one in Pollokshields. And we have just run our first successful community share offer, which closed on the 18th of June, which offered local people and community organisations the opportunity to invest in the project and to become members of the cooperative. So I guess it brings me on to the key topic that I'm interested in raising today, and that's the one of ownership, which is perhaps the elephant in the room in an event that's sponsored by Scottish Power, which, as I'm sure a lot of you are aware, is actually owned by a Spanish multinational company called Iberdrola. Because if we want to deliver a just transition to a low carbon economy, we must increase community ownership of the solutions so that local people benefit directly. And we also need business models, whether that's local public ownership of energy infrastructure, like they're doing in cities in Germany, Hamburg and Munich, where they have taken back public ownership of the energy grids, or whether it's cooperative models like Glasgow Community Energy. We need business models that are driven by values, principles and social objectives, and not just by maximising financial return. Because we're lagging behind many of our European neighbours. Denmark and Germany are really good examples, because we went down that path of privatisation and marketisation in the 80s and 90s, which has prioritised short-term gain for shareholders over long-term strategic planning to decarbonise our energy and our transport sector. So I'm really interested looking at the results from the Slido so far, because it looks like national government policy and regulatory frameworks is still coming out on top. That's certainly what I voted for. I would like to see I'd like to see in Scotland are policies that are similar to those introduced in Denmark in the 1980s, which really put an emphasis on localised forms of collective ownership. So Denmark has what is known as a residency criteria law, which means that nobody can own a stake in a renewable energy generation project unless they actually live within the municipality that it serves. So if we were to do something similar like that in Scotland, in the UK, then it would mean that all of the wealth generated from a place like Whiteley's wind farm, which we can, see from the city centre, over 200 wind turbines just sitting there, all of that wealth could be reinvested back into Glasgow to accelerate the just transition and to improve the quality of all of our citizens' lives.
Okay, thanks ever so much, Ellie, for that challenge. We now have the opportunity to turn to the questions that have been posed by our audience, of which there are quite a few. But in the first instance, I wondered if it was possible to bring up the poll results. I'm talking to the studio team who are managing the screen. I'll talk while there we go. Because if anything, what's interesting here is the even spread across all of these, if you put planning to one side, which seems to have come down, but there's it's very hard to kind of separate out the top three in particular. of course, I think there is a kind of cycle between these where no one can exist without the other. And I just wanted to particularly pick up on number 2, which is around public engagement and support, which follows up on some of the points that were made earlier, particularly by Jen, and just reflect on the fact that we've just seen the Citizens Assembly report be published in Scotland. We've seen the UK Citizens Assembly report be warmly welcomed and reinforced, I think, in the report that the Committee on Climate Change just produced last week in some of its conclusions. And in particular, I kind of pose this question in the first instance to Gavin, to Ellie, and anyone else who wants to come in, as to what value or what importance do you place on the things like citizens' assemblies, and how do we enable them and more systemically within our decision making, if indeed you think they have a role to play? So I'll go to Gavin, and then Ellie or Jen or anybody else that wants to come in, if you can just nod, I'll try and bring you in.
Yeah, thanks very much. I genuinely believe that citizen participation and co-creation and decision making is absolutely crucial if you're going to be successful in this. There's no way any one organisation or institution can do what we need to be done alone. I said in my presentation that the just transition was core to what we want to achieve in Glasgow, and that's absolutely true, and it should be evident in what we're doing. That being said, I will completely put my hands up and say we could be doing it a lot better, and we have been inspired by cities across the world that we're in networks with who have much, much better approaches to participation. And a lot of our Swedish and Scandinavian friends, the way that citizens interact there, the way that they are open to sharing their data, the way that they are appreciative of the chance of failure and the risk inherent in big change, is something that we don't have in the UK. We're asked to be innovative, we're asked to make transformational changes, but often crucified if it doesn't go right first time. So there's a lot of work to be done, I think, on all sides to improving that in the UK, but we really are trying. And part of launching things like the Sustainable Glasgow website is to try and make it more transparent, the work that we're doing, try and make it easier to be reachable. We are having a citizens' assembly. We did do a lot of consultation on the climate plan as best we could under a pandemic. We are trying to make sure that there's participatory budgeting as well. We are making a lot of these efforts, but it's something that we need to be better at. But ultimately, I completely support that approach. I completely support engaging with the public at all levels and at all ages. It's something we've tried to do for a long time, and ultimately need to get better at. So I think that's my position.
Thank you, Gavin. Jen, is this something you'd like to come back on? Okay, and then in particular, I'm interested in how we marry the need for greater levels of public engagement, strengthening and reinforcing the public mandate for action, but also the need for an accelerated response. We know we need to be going about 30 times faster in some areas of our decarbonisation agenda if we're to hit targets such as those that Glasgow or Edinburgh have set. So how do we wed that accelerated the urgency to the climate crisis with a need for deliberation and greater public participation?
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting discussion point, and we're seeing this being kind of raised almost as if climate action can't happen in a kind of democratic way, and there's increasing amounts of perspectives and experience being shared that actually these democratic processes, these participatory processes where you have deliberation, not simply consultation on an individual proposal, but deliberation over a series of change mechanisms, that ultimately leads to better, more whole system solutions that are fairer and can actually accelerate progress. And I think just kind of linking into something that Gavin said there is that seeing this as a kind of an ongoing conversation, that this is a process that needs to flex and evolve, and the publics are very good at handling complexity and long-term thinking, but we need to use the right tools to engage those conversations. And there's a slight difference between, say, the climate assemblies, which guide kind of nationwide conversation, with, say, the climate assemblies that might be kind of city orientated, or participatory budgeting that might be at a kind of a smaller level. And those that, I'm not saying that there's one that's better than the other, but they all serve different purposes and have their place, and we need all these tools. I think it is really interesting and very encouraging, and also slightly concerning, the importance of the role of public engagement being recognised now in things like the Climate Change Committee reports. The reason why I say slightly concerning is because I think we knew that, 10 years ago, but it's only now that it's being written. It's the kind of the main points of the policy reports coming out. But I guess also there's a difference between public engagement and then actually public involvement. And the things I was talking about was public involvement. Public engagement can sometimes be simply canvassing views rather than engaging in these kind of longer term thinking, deliberation, conversations, so that you have a resilient community and connected stakeholders that are working together with that shared vision.
Thank you, Jen. I mean, you're absolutely right. We have known this for some time, and it's, in some ways, it's frustrating that it's taken so long to come to the fore. I'm reminded of Einstein's ladder of participation, which one of you two will be familiar with, which is actually about the importance of making sure we have two-way dialogue, which does build resilience, which actually engages with, hate the phrase, but lay knowledges or public knowledges, and gives it equal value. And I think that's a real challenge, but it's one that we're going to have to grapple with if we're going to have the interventions we need to see. Ellie, is there anything you wanted to bring in on this with regards to engaging community groups, the kind of the capacity of local government or others to kind of engage properly with grassroots movements to kind of accelerate the response to climate change?
Yeah, I think what I was thinking about was the Scottish Government's Climate Assembly, which I actually contributed to in terms of the public transport campaign. I think as a campaigner, what I find particularly frustrating is actually the relentlessness of the consultations, and the fact that the things that we're saying in the consultations don't seem to be acted on. So I know that the report from the Climate Assembly is now sitting with the Scottish Government. They have 6 months to respond to it and to decide what they're going to take forward. And let's just hope that they do take forward the recommendations, because there's absolutely no point in having these consultations if the things that communities decide on the best way forward aren't actually acted on. And I think that if you can get that combination right of doing a very thorough democratic consultation and then actually acting on it, then you can, things can happen very quickly. And I hope that that's what will happen off the back of the Climate Assembly.
I agree, Ellie. I'm just, again, I recall ages ago when I was at uni, there was a book called The Tyranny of Participation, which makes the point that if you engage with people who invest their time and energy to participate in developing policy and making their recommendations, and they don't see a positive consequence from that, it can leave a very damaging legacy, which is why, while explosion of participation is to be welcomed, it has to be, it has to lead to a track record of change. Otherwise, it can actually be really undermining and can damage democracy. So there's definitely kind of a cautionary tale to the increase in participatory events. I'm now going to go to the Slido questions, and I'll start with you, Ken, and then Neil, perhaps. But the top question, which is a great question, and it's one that we perhaps don't ask often enough, but what hasn't worked? What's been the biggest failure so far in your view, and what have you learned from it? So, given that we're going to have to move at pace, and we absolutely will be learning while we're doing, and we'll make mistakes, I'd be really interested if you're, I mean, admittedly, this is off your heads and it's fairly immediate. So if you can speak to that question, that'd be great. So we'll go Ken, and then we'll go Neil, and then Gavin, and we'll see where we are then.
Okay, well, I was, funnily enough, I was in a meeting yesterday talking about a very similar thing. One of the things, the sideshows that's going on just now, it's hardly a sideshow, is Housing to 2040, which is a 20-year programme to try to make huge changes to all aspects of housing policy at the moment. And climate change and retrofit is a big chunk of that, and it's a 20-year programme. What I think is really striking is that we have a situation where you have aims and goals, and you have diagnosis of what is the reason for seeking those aims and goals, but that's not necessarily matched by a kind of infrastructure of monitoring, of collecting data, of evaluating intermediate success, and then reassessing the direction of travel in the light of those intermediate stages. And that's kind of true of most long-term policy programmes which seek to be transformative. And it seems to me that there are lessons to be learned from other parts of public policy, from going to the Christie Commission and looking at things like that and saying, you know, do we have the kind of analytical infrastructure to actually be clear about what's going on? And it returns to this issue about complex systems and thinking how you do monitor something with so many moving parts that's going on at the one time. So I can't really speak to failures in the climate change policy world, but I certainly think there are other structures of ambitious policy programs which have failed or not been as successful as they could because they haven't had that kind of mission approach with intermediate stages of evaluation.
Thank you, Ken. Neil, do you want to reflect on that or your own experiences on Orkney?
Yeah, sure. I think one of the things that we've been most disappointed with has been our inability to convince Ofgem and SSEN as the DNO to improve the network connections here. And we've been at this for 20 years or so. And we know, for example, we know where the tides are, and we know that we will need a means to get energy out of them, but we've failed to manage to get them to actually provide a better connection to these areas. And that's been very frustrating. And in part, that's because of the bounds of the regulator, who are tasked principally with just the cost to the consumer and security supply. They have no recognition of value of innovation, value of the industrial activity, value of the supported communities in remote areas. The lines upon which they run are unnecessarily narrow. So I think our failure to get any improvement there has been a challenge. Now, I think that is going to be changing. The strategy and policy statement is about to be produced at some stage, which hopefully will bring Ofgem properly into the tent and get them properly focused on decarbonisation in the round. So I think that's been a failure to date and has held back industry quite considerably locally. So we're really looking forward to the change that's going to come there. The other thing I think we also need to recognise is that repetition is not sexy, and unfortunately it's essential. So when you do a new technology, you're rubbish at it the first time, you're a bit better the next time, and you get very good as you practice. But unfortunately, from a political point of view, people often just want to cut a ribbon on a new thing, and just saying I'm doing the same thing as I did before but a bit duller is not really a good way to attract finance. So I think there's a need to realise that repetition is critically important to build equipment that is going to become a product that you can just take out the box and plug it in. You know, you don't want excitement when you plug a new appliance in. It should just work, and that takes time and effort and expenditure and unremitting aggressive change to make these things alter. And we have to recognise that is a real thing. So trying to get people to recognise that bigger is not necessarily better, and duller is actually quite important.
Yeah, some good points there. The repetition, the importance of that is clearly critical. Gavin, I'm just going to come to you, but very quickly, Ken, someone's asked a question, how will the public or will people be able to come and visit these retrofits? Is there any way in which you're able to kind of share that learning? Is there something you could quickly say to that, and then I'll just come back to Gavin?
Yeah, three very quick things. One, the construction is underway right now, scheduled to be ready something like October, November. We're going to make a film and a video, which we plan to thoroughly disseminate and engage with it. But we have got a budget and a programme of activities we want to engage with a whole bunch of stakeholders about the work. But yes, I mean, in brief, yes, we're trying to, it's a demonstration project. We're trying to evaluate it to see what the wider learning is. So our whole raison d'etre is to do just that.
Super, thanks. Gavin, back to you, and the question, which was a while ago, is what hasn't worked? What have you learned through failure?
So many things that haven't worked. If I can pick one out, I guess we have for a long time in Glasgow been pushing to develop district heating. As I said in my presentation, we've done extremely well as a nation and as a city in decarbonising electricity, and we've brought emissions down from electricity quite considerably. But heat remains an issue, and it remains an issue in many different ways. And comments about the building stock and all that makes perfect sense. But district heating is a very viable solution, or should be, in this country. And we have a few networks within, or a few islands, I should say, within Glasgow, which have been very successful at delivering, less carbon-intensive heat and often less expensive heat. But that reduction in cost has been to the cost of others, and that's down to Scottish Government policy. And we have been lobbying the Scottish Government for, I think now, about 6 years about non-domestic rates in relation to district heating. And ultimately, in a city like Glasgow, where we have a lot of low-density housing, we are paying a premium to put in what are effectively net zero solutions. We pay a rate burden on that network, which is disproportionate to that if you were to install gas. There have been discounts applied by the Scottish Government, which are welcomed. We thanked them for that. I think we're at 55% discount, but it still boggles the mind as to why we can't just allocate a category for district heating and a rate that's on par with gas and fair. So at the moment, district heating is continually difficult to achieve, and we have a huge river running through the city that has the potential to provide a massive proportion of the heat required to the city. We have technical surveys, technical reports that show how feasible that is, but that rates burden has killed a number of projects in this city. And that is something that needs to be addressed. So what is frustrating for me, what is a failure, I think, is that policy at that level, while pushing for net zero and pushing for low carbon solutions, on one hand is promoting that, but on the other hand is maintaining policies that are punitive to those solutions. So it's very difficult for us as cities to manage that. You have the Heat Networks Regulation Bill coming out and all the regulatory frameworks to try and support heat networks, yet there is still an increased cost for doing that. So I find it very frustrating that we can't make simple solutions quickly to simple questions, and we're still stuck in this merry-go-round of applying just perfunctory discounts as opposed to actually dealing with the problem.
Thanks, Gavin. Ellie, you particularly, what from your experience hasn't worked, and what have you learned as through that experience? I think you wanted to come in, if that's right.
Oh, I wanted to come in on the public transport one, but I just say very briefly on Glasgow Community Energy developing the project. I mean, it's been 5 or 6 years in the making. It's been an immense amount of work for a volunteer team. More than you can really realistically expect people to do on a voluntary basis just to get 2 solar installations up and running. And the path could have been smoothed a lot easier for us. We had a huge number of hurdles to get over. But it's been a massive learning experience. So that's why I think community energy is something that should be encouraged, because you learn so much about the energy system and all of the problems with it through the process of trying to get something like this off the ground. And it's just the beginning for Glasgow Community Energy. Now we've got our first 2 sites. We're hoping to expand over the next few years, and we'll be going to the new members of the co-op who joined through our community share offer to get their input in as we develop the next stage.
I just wonder on that, did you partner up with the Edinburgh Cooperative and learn from what, I mean, they came along like a few years before and did it. Were there systems in place to kind of make sure that you didn't have to completely reinvent the wheel?
Yeah, well, we were partnering with Energy for All, which is a kind of cooperative organisation that helps other renewable energy co-ops get off the ground, and they developed the Edinburgh Solar Co-op. So we did get a lot of information and advice from the Edinburgh model, but things still needed to be kind of reinvented for Glasgow. And yeah, we would have loved to have done a bigger project. I mean, Edinburgh have at least 23 sites. I think they've now increased to more than 30 in the last year. So they got solar installed on 30 public buildings across the city. We were wanting to do something on that sort of scale to start off with, but various problems, well, with the council wanting to do their own solar installations, also with the PFI schools, that we couldn't get to the owner of the schools to make a arrangement with them. So there were lots of barriers that we encountered along the way, which meant we just ended up with 2 schools. But you know, it's just the beginning, like I said, and we're hoping to expand. Now we're up and running.
Thank you. You touched on that challenge of replication and then requiring actual redevelopment, because the nature of place-based context and different situations means you can't just adopt and reapply one place in another. So we're really coming towards the end, and I'm ever so sorry to all the people who have asked really good questions. I'm going to ask each panelist to come back with one remark in response to this last question. And maybe you can, you obviously do it from your perspective, but you can see there's questions there around transport, there's questions there around sustainable development goals, there's questions about, and I've just been told we will try and post some questions after the fact on the website. But the question I had is really, last summer there was an explosion of engagement about build back better and go forward faster and post-COVID recovery, all of those things. As we get to a point where thankfully lots of us have received 1, if not 2 vaccinations, and things start to kind of look like coming back to something resembling normality, where do you see the legacy of COVID having a lasting positive impact on communities as we transition to net zero? So where do you see this transition, the impact of COVID actually having some, kind of not springing back into place and reverting back to type? Or what do we need to do in order to hold on to that? I know it's quite a big question and we don't have very long, so if you could just try and narrow it down to one kind of remark. And I see, Neil, you put your finger up, which is very helpful, so I'll come to you first, and then just so you know, panelists, I'll go Neil, and then I'll go Ken, then I'll go Jen, then I'll go Ellie, and I'll end with Gavin. I'll forget that order. So Neil and then Ken. Thank you, Neil.
It was unthinkable that we would ask people to stay in their homes for the best part of a year. It was unthinkable that we would have the temerity to say we had to stop burning fossil fuels. We've proved the first one is entirely possible. We now need to recognise the other one is something that we've got to just get on with. So I think the legacy is that the unthinkable thoughts are not really unthinkable so much. And I think we need to have the confidence to actually push really hard, because the stay at home was achieved through social license. We need to make sure we bring people along with the change that is going to be made. We don't have a choice about this. If we don't fix this, it'll fix us. So we just need to bring people along.
Thank you very much, Neil. Ken.
Yeah, so I'll just build on something that Neil just said there. The consequences of us staying at home was that many people who could found they didn't like the homes that they had, or found that there was something they could do about it, or so they went out and bought other homes, and they moved away from high density city centres. They tried to get better space, better Wi-Fi connection and such like, and actually that's led to the highest rising house prices in 15 years in the UK, so somebody said even this morning. And that's not what was part of the plan. I don't think. That's incredibly redistributive in a negative way and an unequalising way. So it just shows you how when the housing becomes a centrepiece of something like a pandemic, there are consequences, knock-on consequences to that, which maybe we don't expect. But I think at the same time, it does suggest to me an opening that people will think more seriously about retrofit to make their own properties more habitable, better under a whole set of ways, not just about actual climate change, but improving the quality of their life inside those homes as well. So I think at a personal, individual scale, that has actually opened the door.
Thanks, Jen. Did I go Jen or did I go Ellie? Jen, I went Jen, you've taken yourself off mute. Thank you. Off you go.
Yeah, and I need to think about how to sort of phrase this in a concise way. But I think that one of, I'm very reluctant to use the word kind of benefits, but one of the things that we see now is public health at the fore, and different aspects of public health, meaning air quality, active travel, the spaces for people initiatives that Gavin talked about. And so this kind of shift to consider benefits or sustainability that's beyond carbon, right? So we're talking about climate action beyond carbon, that we're talking about benefits to public health and well-being. And I think that one of the longer lasting legacies is the slight reframing to think of kind of the systems of sustainability, which I do think that COVID and our response to COVID has had a role to play.
Thanks, Jen. Ellie, and then to Gavin. Thanks, Ellie.
Yeah, just quickly, I think it has given us all a chance to localise our lifestyles, which is obviously something we're going to have to do to achieve carbon reduction targets. Not just about travelling more sustainably, it's about travelling less. And I think the consequence of that and spending a lot more time in our local communities is that you do start to notice that you have agency to be able to change the things around you that aren't working as you wish that they would. So yeah, I hope it's encouraged a lot more active participation in our local areas that will be positive going forward.
Super. Thank you ever so much. And last but not least, Gavin.
Yeah, I agree with everything that's been said. I think everyone has taken every point just about that I would have raised. So as not to repeat those that have been raised, I think that as a result of the pandemic, our appreciation of nature and green space has increased exponentially. I think people's, people are reportedly, when working from home, taking more time to go out and exercise, more interest in nature. Our parks have been incredible, and Glasgow is often named the Dear Green Place, and never have we seen our parks become so important and so integral a part of the infrastructure of a city. So I think we talk a lot about heat pumps and solar and co-ops and all these things, but we have this wonderful green and blue asset sitting in our city that is so important and so critical to people's health. So I think our maintenance of those assets and the value of those assets will only increase as a result of the pandemic.
Brilliant. Thank you ever so much. Thank you, Gavin. Thanks all of you ever so much for your thoughtful contributions. Thank you to the audience who participated, did the poll, asked the questions, and apologies that I wasn't able to get through all of them, but we have run out of time, and I think you'll agree we've had some stimulating debates, some interesting discussions, some things to take away and think about, certainly. So really thank you, all of you on the panel, for your time this afternoon. I just want to end by flagging the next two events in this series. So we have series of podcasts coming out with Tim Jackson, Professor Tim Jackson, looking at consumption in the context of tackling climate change, which I'm sure will be fascinating. Anybody who's read his books will know that he's very much an authority and a leading light on that particular debate. So please do look out for those on the website or on social media. And then in September, and we'll soon be opening registrations for this, we'll be looking at the kind of connection and commuter kind of travel future that is set out in front of us as a consequence of the COVID legacy and what that looks like as we try and get to net zero. So two more interesting opportunities for people to join, to listen or to participate in. There is a survey on Slido there just for your feedback on this event. We really appreciate it. So if you could take 2 minutes to just say what you thought of it, that would be much appreciated. But otherwise, I say thank you to everybody and hope you all have a fine afternoon and have a summer that's really nice. So all the best and see you later. Bye-bye.